And with that, I'd like to move on to our second speaker, and that is Professor Henk Barendregt. Henk is Emeritus Professor of the Foundations of Mathematics and Computer Science at the Radboud University here in Nijmegen. He studied mathematical logic at Utrecht University and received his PhD cum laude in 1971. He then moved to do a postdoc at Stanford University, where he also discovered contemplative practices. He studied Zen meditation there, and then when he came back to the Netherlands, he practiced Vipassana meditation. And in 2006, he actually qualified to teach Vipassana himself. So he's received substantial funding for his research, including a Spinoza Award in 2002, and he's used some of that funding to found a research group to understand insight meditation and its effect in neuropsychological terms. He's going to use his expertise in both these areas today, I hope, to reflect on the nature of consciousness and how we can use it to develop first-hand understanding of it and the suffering that we impose upon ourselves by our mistaken understanding of reality. So the title of his talk is Consciousness, Flexibility, Risk Factor, Wisdom. Henk, the floor is yours.
Now, this presentation is based on trained phenomenology in the form of insight meditation. And it's based on collaborative work with Anthony Raffona of Sapienza University in Rome. So, we first demark consciousness. There are two types of consciousness, namely the one that you only are aware, and the one that you also know that you are aware. For example, when you cross a bridge with a bike or a car, you may not know that at that moment, but then a little bit later you are on the other side of town, and then you realize, oh hey, I'm already here. Then you know that you're there, but you were not knowing on the bridge. And everybody knows this kind of phenomena that sometimes we do things mindless. Now the knowing part is also called mindfulness, and hence it's not always present. Moreover, consciousness is compound. It doesn't consist of one thing. And one way of looking at it is that there is input, sensory input, there is action. And the behaviorist last century made the mistake of only wanting to describe stimulus and response, input and action, and they forgot about the state. But state is very important, because the state, as together with the input, determines what action we are going to do. So we write consciousness is input, state, action, or simply ISA. The next point is that consciousness is dynamic, and that there is a stream of consciousness. C is in fact C of T, where T goes through time. And we later speak about the structure of time. So together, C equals I, T, S, T, A, T, and hence it consists of three streams. And this you know very well from your daily life. If you're a visual person, you remember the day as a movie of pictures that came to you. If you're an active person and you think of your life as doing things, you remember the day as all the things you did, intentionally did today. And if you're maybe, let's say, a romantic person, you remember all the mind states you had today. And for those people, that is more important. Now, every CT is called a mind moment. And by the interaction of I, A, and S, humans create a sense of self, agency. Now, usually humans try to optimize input. They want to have nice possessions in order to be happy. But all nice possessions have a dark side, or well, a side effect that you need to maintain them. And it's better to optimize the mind state, because then directly you can go to the happy being, state of being. So here we see the effect of the mind state in an unwholesome case or in a wholesome case. The S on the body and mind and behavior. If it's unwholesome, well, you're subject to stress, and it comes in as distress, so that deteriorates your immune system, and you have to go to a physician. On a phenomenological level in the mind, you have to go to a psychiatrist if there are too many unwholesome states. And on the behavioral side, you have to go to the police. The wholesome states, however, give you health, happiness, and helping others. The next point about consciousness, that is what the philosophers call intentional. It's about something, a topic, also called sometimes the object. What's interesting is that the object usually comes from the world. You see a tree, you see something else, but you can also observe the state, or you can observe your actions. Now, mindfulness is consciousness that takes part of itself as a topic. And that gives you flexibility, because here we see an I, S, and an A, and inside the S there is some angriness, and that gives you angry actions. But you can change this by looking at this, and then the angriness is now part of the input. And you can do that with an equanimous mind, non-judgmental mind, Kabat-Zinn would say. Then you just see the angriness, but you don't need to react angrily. Now, it may sound that mind states is a complex notion. A friend of mine was teaching children of the age 3, and to such a little boy, he explained what an angry mind state was at the moment that the boy was angry. An hour later, the boy was glad and was smiling, and then my friend said, and now you have a happy mind state. And the boy understood. When the boy came home, his mother was angry at a certain point, and the boy said, "Hey, Mama, now you have an angry mind state." And the mother was flabbergasted. The angry mind state melted away, and she said, "Where did you learn this?" And now also she's following mindfulness course of the same teacher. So this is the power and for flexibility using mindfulness. But mindfulness also can be seen as a risk factor. First of all, to use mindfulness more, it needs to be developed, and can be developed in two ways. The duration of mindfulness can be longer, so the stretch of time during which you have the knowing, and the resolution can be higher, so the short milli moments in which you are mindful. So if you increase in both directions, duration and resolution, then you can see the following. First, consciousness is like a stroboscope. For those of you that have gone to a discotheque, or for the older ones of you, it's like an 8mm movie in which you have many pictures that are projected fast, 25 a second, and then you have the impression that Charlie Chaplin is walking. In the very old movies of 1910, the movement was a little shocking, a little like that, because there were not enough frames. But if you write mindfulness is of high resolution, you can see that consciousness is like a stroboscope. So time is not like the real numbers, but it is a Z, a discrete set of values. So you have C of -1, this should be -1, C of 0, C of 1, etc. And mindfulness in this context can be modeled as observing the previous CT from the next mind moment, CT plus 1. So here we have this model now. You have still the triples, but they're flashing triples, each time a different one. So now, in fact, you have three streams, three stroboscopic streams, so to say. And when you see that, you can also see that consciousness is an automatic process without the self. It goes on in a semi-deterministic, quasi-deterministic way. And there is no self involved. However, it can form a self. It can produce the illusion to have agency. What is very important that many people have wrong view that the self is a substantial entity and that it is permanent. Now, going on this way, this higher resolution mindfulness leads to experience consisting as those fast fluctuating mind moments without self, and this is felt like emptiness. The French psychiatrist Lacan calls the lack. That's lack of agency. And this view shocks ego because ego thought that it had independent, substantial existence. And this shock leads to suffering. And this is all described in the classical insight meditation text. I've also experienced it. The shock leads to fear, irrational fears, panic attacks, phobias. It leads to delusion of danger, paranoia, and it leads to disenchantment, which is also translated as utter disgust, nausea. And we see here an interesting partial cross-section of psychiatric disorders. And these three are called the three fundamental characteristics of, they say, of consciousness. I would say the three fundamental characteristics of, they call it of existence, I would say of consciousness. So this is non-permanence, everything fluctuates in the stroboscopic way. Non-self, it goes on in an automatic way, and this leads to suffering. At this moment, the notion of permanent ego is seriously or mortally wounded, but it isn't yet eradicated. At this moment, ego is desperately in search of a hold and finds it as a rigid cover-up. That means it finds a kind of identity to symptomatically release, give a release, and to systematically hide the lack that was earlier experienced. But this rigid cover-up causes pain because you have to maintain it and you have to maintain the view how things should go. And at the same time, it gives a fear for change. So we have now three forms of suffering, the classical ones described in the Buddhist text, namely suffering as pain, suffering as fear for change, and suffering as existential fear. And here I made some dynamical system pictures to render the idea. I choose those pictures to render the idea. This is ordinary distress because we are always try to avoid pain, but sometimes we succeed, sometimes we do not succeed. It depends on the conditions, and therefore we are restless. Here we see a different cover-up as a stable but rigid mind state, or rather a mind ongoing state, scenario. And in this case, there is the fear of change that is bothersome. Here the person did not succeed in covering up and was seeing the existential fear and realized there is no escape, because any escape, either like this or like that, is an illusion. Now, once the meditator has experienced this, there becomes a wish for relinquishing, for releasing all this suffering. What one has to do is to first release the worldly suffering, namely suffering because you want to go in a certain direction and your environment doesn't let you go. That's worldly suffering. And then later relinquish the existential suffering. Both can be done in the same way or almost in the same way. And what is needed is to develop discipline, concentration, and insight. In this way, it's not the case that you're fully disciplined and then you get fully concentrated and then you fully have insight. No, with a little bit of discipline, you develop a little more concentration than usual, and then a little more insight as usual. And this motivates you to go back to have even more discipline, like diligence and well-behaving with, with respect towards others and yourself. That gives you even more concentration and that gives you even more insight. And how this goes on is on the next slide. And all is directed towards diffusing the underlying quasi-attractor of wrong view, because all these forms of suffering depend on wrong view. Again, that was the idea that we have a stable self that is fixed and permanent. So, what were we? We are in this compound, stroboscopic, and selfless stream of consciousness. Here it is. And I depict it now in the way somebody with a harnessed personality who is afraid for change has it. By meditation, what are you doing? You keep constant the input and your action. So everybody knows that meditation is sitting still on your chair or pillow. So the A is fixed. But then you need to fix also your internal behavior, your thoughts, so that requires a bit more discipline to acquire that. And then the input is also to be kept constant by constantly focusing on one object. And if you're sidetracked, and as soon as you know that, remember, we don't always know what we are doing, but as soon as we notice it, we go back to the meditation object, the fixed eye. And after some time, we succeed in obtaining this kind of stream, which I draw here. We're concentrated. But the problem is not yet solved because tendencies that are in us are still there. You see the basis of that cover-up is still there. So as soon as you will get more input, you fall back to this type of scenario. But now, if you succeed in having this stream, then fully knowing this simplified stream will result, perhaps through habituation, this has to be investigated, in objectless consciousness, also called nibbana, or in English, nirvana, which enables a powerful reset. Everything blanks, and at that moment you reset because the dynamical system has stopped for a moment, and then you can go out and you're into freedom. But here we get, so you escape from the quasi-attractor, but here we get the freedom paradox. And what is this? That freedom increases when one is equanimously observing that consciousness is fully determined. Why does freedom increase then, you would say? Well, you do not need any longer to pretend that there is a free will. And in this way there is autonomy, but it is not owned by us or by anyone. It's our system, body-mind system, and your heart that makes decisions, not biased by the person you were pretending to be. And to explain this a little bit better, I will come with the metaphor of the goat and about some text of Merleau-Ponty. So we can compare Homo sapiens with the goat, who's bound with a rope around its neck. Here you see the rope around the neck attached to a pole, and then the poor goat can also only walk in a circle and eat the grass there. Now, at some meditation class, the goat learned not to eat the grass, but he learned to eat the rope, to gnaw on the rope. And then he's free. What can he do? He can walk away. He can walk in the forest or in the mountains, find female goats and play around, and maybe go back, or maybe not. So that goat that is free is still conditioned by the laws of nature, by wanting to meet other goats. But he is no longer tied by this rope. And in the case of human beings, the rope is this wrong view that gives us our desires and our aversions. So we understand that this goat is more free without the rope than otherwise. Merleau-Ponty said something similar. I'm a psychologist. I'm a psychological and historical structure. Along with existence, I received a way of existing, or a style. All my actions and thoughts are related to this structure. And even a philosopher's thought is merely a way of making explicit his hold upon the world, which is all he is. And yet, I'm free, not in spite of or beneath these motivations, but rather by their means. For that meaningful life, that particular signification of nature and history that I am, does not restrict my access to the world. It's rather my means of communication with it. So now I can summarize. In this talk, some qualities of consciousness have been emphasized, namely that it consists of proto-consciousness together with a languageless knowing. When we drive a car and we are in the other part of town, well, we may say, okay, I'm now in this area with language, but just the looking is enough to know that you're on the other side. So we can call this awareness plus mindfulness that makes consciousness. Then consciousness is fluctuating. It's discrete, I would say, not continuous, not based on the real numbers, but on the whole numbers and positive and negative integers. And mindfulness can be seen as that CT plus 1 is reflexively observing the previous CT, which enables you to have emotional regulation, which enables you to have insight, especially if you increase the duration and refinement of your mindfulness. And you get a stroboscopic quasi-deterministic view, and that leads to suffering. And with the wrong view, this is unbearable, leading to madness and war. But liberation comes with discipline, concentration, and insight, and then you obtain peace and increased freedom. Thank you.
It's very inspirational. Thanks a lot. I'm going to ask you if you could perhaps unshare your screen so I can see the other speakers. And then I'm going to open this up to questions, both from the audience at home and from the other speakers, and to answer one question that just came in. Yes, the talks are being recorded and they will be available later on the Essentia Foundation website. Okay. we have a question from one of our viewers, which is, how do we avoid the stark emptiness without the concept of a soul, not necessarily co-consistent with the ego or particular brain activity? Thank you. Henk.
I did not get the question. How do we
avoid stark emptiness, as described by Nagarjuna, I don't know how to pronounce that, without the concept of a soul, which is not necessarily co-consistent with the ego or with particular brain activity?
We are not going to negate emptiness. We are getting into peace with it.
Yeah.
So we are domesticating it. That's the point.
Okay. Domesticating emptiness. Bernardo, Helene, can I invite you if you have a question?
No, go. I wanted to say.
Okay, Bernardo then.
I found it very interesting, Henk. In the beginning, you tried to sort of corral these ideas in a mathematical model, at least with the language of mathematics and symbols. Was that helpful to you to model it that way? Did it help you get an insight into what this all actually means at the end?
No. The trajectory was traversed. But to explain it to you, especially at the end, that you simplify a rigid cover-up to this lean one, I hope that mathematical view helps you to imagine what concentration is. And then one can say, if you are fully mindful during that loop, you get empty consciousness because of maybe the habituation, and you have a reset. So I hope to help the audience with it. But during the practice, it was not conceived that way.
Okay, good. Helene, we have time for your question too.
Yeah, I actually want to say I don't have a question.
I have another one, if I may.
Yeah, go for it. I just want to say it was a very nice presentation, Henk. I guess I've seen it before also. But.
Yeah. Bernardo then.
You also used pictures of chaotic systems, Henk, and all the pictures you chose seem to have attractors and to model chaotic systems, which is a mathematical idea that certain systems are so dependent on their initial conditions that it's impossible to predict their behavior, since the tiniest imaginable change in initial conditions can completely change where the system goes. The fact that you chose chaos theory pictures illustrate what you mean. Is that a deeper clue to how consciousness behaves? Is consciousness a chaotic system? That's what I'm trying to ask.
What I emphasize, and also in the wording of my talk, is that they are not strange attractors, but they are quasi-attractors. In a strange attractor, it's mathematically impossible to escape. But in a quasi-attractor, especially what you emphasize right now, is that when you make the conditions slightly different, you may escape. So again, it was a kind of what we call upaya, skillful means, the didactics of telling the story, to hope something comes over and inspire you and the audience to investigate this. Don't believe it, investigate.
Yeah, experience. Thank you. We also have a question from one of the viewers, Franca. She says, can mindfulness, and should we perhaps consider mindfulness a placebo?
No, it's concentration which is a placebo. But it's not even a placebo, it's an anesthesia. With concentration, you anesthetize your suffering, and that's quite fine. And if you every day meditate to get that concentration, you will have much less suffering in your life. However, it's not sustainable. There can be conditions in which you are not able to do that daily suppression of the suffering. And for that reason, there is mindfulness, which has insight in it, so that you can see the mechanism of the suffering, and then you may escape. So mindfulness is the real medicine. Concentration is the symptomatic medicine. But you need it. Otherwise, it's too painful to go through this process.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have one last question, which is, you've talked very much about the first-hand experience of meditation and how you can use that to alleviate suffering. But I know, of course, that you've also, in the past, invested in a sort of third-hand research program of meditation. And my question is, did you find that useful? Did that inform you? Did it inform your practice? Did it inform your understanding?
The third hand? No, you see, the third-hand investigations are way behind.
Way behind, okay.
The first-hand investigations. Yeah. So this is also hopefully an inspiration to researchers to do the right experiments.
Yes. First-hand experiments as well as third-hand.
Yeah, well, the experiments, what the meditator in the laboratory does is the same, but the setup should be different, or
yes,
and we don't know yet how to do it. So that's an exciting field, and I think this century will be fully occupied with it.
Okay.
But who knows? It can go much faster. Helene, let's do your best, right?
Yes. Okay. I have one last question from the audience at home, which is a question for Henk, but perhaps also for Bernardo, from Lawrence, and that is what leaves of the ego as a necessary focal point or I'm going to need my glasses here, excuse me for a moment, or contraction, dissociation of mind. Okay. I think what he's asking is what is left of the ego as a necessary focal point, or do we need it as a focal point, or a contraction or dissociation of mind at large?
If I may go first, we do need ego.
Yeah.
So after the meditation and even after liberation, we need to think to have to go to the bakery and buy some bread. And there is no problem with ego. But if you think that that ego is fixed and is always like that, then there is a problem. So meditation doesn't lead only to a non-self, but it leads eventually to beyond self, okay, in which you can have several forms of self.
Thank you. Bernardo, would you like to add to that?
And I think Henk just covered it all. You need an ego because you need to know to which mouth to bring the fork. Otherwise, you die. But that's about it. It doesn't go much beyond that.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much again for a very inspirational talk.